Hey folks, today we're covering Dev Diary 174 and this is going to be on the mechanics of China. They do say straight away this is going to be a very long Dev Diary, so as always I'll leave a link to this in the description down below. I'll also add some timestamps for the most important sections of this if you just want to skip around to whatever you're interested in. But obviously do watch the video, do hit that like button and do subscribe if you haven't already. But let's just get straight into it. As I say, a lot for us to talk about. The initial bit here just really giving us an introduction and saying that everything that we see here is work in progress. This is currently in development, as they've been saying all the way through this series. So some screenshots we see are going to have placeholder graphics, placeholder numbers, things like that. You'll see that as we go through the Dev Diary. Always keep that in mind, but if you do have feedback, that is what they're after. Do go and put it on the forum. And as I always say, keep it civil, guys. Don't be going in there raging. But the first thing we're going to look at here is actually China, the central state. So one thing to understand in Imperial China in the medieval era is that it was a sophisticated bureaucracy, organized and centralized in ways that were not seen elsewhere in the world. Yes, not even in the Byzantine Empire. And the first thing they're going to show us here is the map once again with some updates. They do say map coloring, drawing, naming, borders, translations. Everything that you see is still work in progress, so not everything that you see here will be how it looks when we actually play the game. The next going to show us the Chinese version of this. This is the exact same map, but with the Chinese names, the exact same kind of stipulation here that everything is work in progress. But again, nice to see it in both versions. Just a very nice map, I think we can all agree. It looks really nice already. They do say there are many layers to this form of government, ranging from low-level district heads to county magistrates, prefects, and provisional governors. But these are all just arms of the bureaucracy. In the central capital is where the heart of power is, and that is the central ministers. They're going to talk about that later on. The Grand Chancellor, and obviously the Emperor. And they're going to cover all of this in the next few sections of the Dev Diary. So the first one of those is the Celestial Government. The government type of China is the Celestial Government. Celestial is a reference to the mandate of heaven, the right to rule held by the Emperor, and also known as the Son of Heaven. Unique to this form of government is the way that titles under the Emperor, whose title is hereditary, are managed and distributed within the game. Similar to the existing admin government type, so that is the Byzantine Empire, how that works. These titles are given out to candidates who hold the highest score whenever the title is vacated. They're going to talk about the exam system later on as well. In contrast, though, to the Byzantines, the scoring calculation in celestial governments is heavily dictated by the merit rank that you hold. You can still spend influence, but you will not be able to attain a higher position unless you've reached the required rank to do so. And then reaching these ranks within the merit system, these will unlock additional kind of bonuses and positions and things like that. So with prefectures, which are like counties, provinces that are duchies, circuits that are kingdoms, these all require higher levels of merit. So as you work up those levels of merit, that's how you can unlock the ability to get these different kind of tiered roles within the government. And then as they mentioned last week, the duchy level does not exist this way in medieval China, but they added it here for gameplay reasons. As we discussed in last week's video, I think it's so it kind of makes sense on the map, especially if you don't own the China DLC. I think they've kind of included duchies in this system, although it wasn't historically there, just so it made more sense within the gameplay, as they said here. And as we discussed in that video, I kind of wish they hadn't, but I see why they did do it, just to make it fit a little bit more into every other system that we currently have as well. And then as we saw last week, China does also have de jure empires, although these don't exist in a stable era. Again, they covered that with last week's Dev Diary. Instead, the highest point in any career is the position of minister, an empire tier type of position, which is going to be covered in the following section. Since China is so large, the Son of Heaven relies on bureaucracy to fill the vacant positions. While he can directly intervene if the situation requires, these positions are generally filled automatically once vacated through a rank system instead of titles reverting to the Emperor as they would in the Byzantines. So it sounds like this system is going to work a little bit like the court positions where they brought in, was it in the Crown update, where you can semi-automate them. It looks like that is the default setting here, or the setting that's basically always going to exist. Although, as they say here, you can directly intervene if you want to. For the most part, it's going to run automatically based on these scores, based on the merit system, and it's going to pick the most eligible person basically every time one of these frees up. So as they said, there are these imperial ministries, and they're going to talk about it here. They do call out again here that everything we see is in active development, and everything in here is probably going to be changed, either scaled up or scaled down, before we get our hands on this content. So the central government of a hegemony tiered celestial government is an impressive feat of bureaucracy, and some say where the true power of the Chinese Empire was found. Throughout Chinese history, there have been many departments and ministries that made up the central bureaucracy, and they're opening this system up so as players we can work our way up the civilian side of the empire. So I guess kind of how it works in the Byzantine Empire, but you're really trying to work your way up these ministries, departments, They're going to talk about these in a second as well, so we'll know a little bit more about what they're talking about. Only those with very high merit rank will even be allowed to put their name forward for these positions, however, so that is something you're going to have to concentrate on if you do want one of these positions. These department heads and ministers will replace the regular council of the emperor, and they will work similarly but different to councillors. First off, the ministers are not appointed by the emperor directly when vacated. Instead, they are filled by the same mechanic that selects governors for admin vassal titles in the empire. You can lobby to make yourself the next Minister of Revenue, but there may be a more powerful political entity competing for these titles. So again, I guess we'll see some like subterfuge scheming here to try get these higher positions within the empire. Generally speaking, the 3 departments and 6 ministry system existed from the Sui dynasty to the Huan dynasty, and that is the system you're going to see in the game. Additionally, they've added 2 other powerful titles, the Grand Chancellor and the Imperial Censor. Mechanically, these positions will have landless titles of the Empire rank to signify their power under only the Emperor himself. So again, I think this is why they brought in this hegemony title, so they could show off these very powerful ministry ranks, which would have been like Empire tier in other regions of the world. But under the Chinese system, it didn't really work that way. So yeah, that's what we're going to get, these like landless Empire titles that you will hold whilst you hold these positions, but then obviously the Emperor's at the top there, really controlling everything that's going on, or, you know, not so much, as we will see later on. The next thing is the Wheels of Bureaucracy. These positions will act as go-betweens between the governors and the Emperor, representing the delegated power of the administration. The Emperor will often interact more directly with the ministers than with specific governors, of which he has many. Many interactions that would usually target your liege will instead target a minister in Imperial China, so that is how it's going to change again from playing like feudal or tribe or something like that. It is going to kind of mechanically play differently here. One way for these ministers to influence the state is through great projects, and they're not actually going to cover how this is exactly going to work. They do say a future dev diary is going to cover this. I will say it's not next week's dev diary. We'll cover that at the end of this video. For example, the Minister of Works can start an infrastructure project targeting multiple circuits, or the Minister of War can start a great project to start preparing for a big military campaign. That does sound very interesting, actually. It'll be cool to hear about these in a later dev diary. Ministers, of course, will get funds to do this, treasury and a salary to be effective administrators, which they can use to pursue these projects or agendas to kind of forward what they want to try do. So the first one they're going to show here is the Grand Chancellor. This is like a souped up version of the normal Chancellor, also known as the Prime Minister. The Grand Chancellor is one of the most powerful political positions in Imperial China. They were the head of the entire civil administration and effectively served as the Emperor's chief executive officer, resulting in them often being seen as the highest ranking official below the Emperor. The title gives many powers, in some situations often equivalent to that of an emperor. This title is also on top of the Diarch Regency list, stepping in when the emperor is unavailable. So if you have this position, you can temporarily be the emperor whilst he's off having some adventures. And you're also going to be able to pick up other bonuses as well, though it doesn't say here exactly what they are. The next one is the Imperial Censor, leading an oversight institution known as the Censorate. This role has the responsibility to investigate corruption, abuse of power, and nepotism. They also offer advice to the Emperor, and uniquely, they can challenge ministers, the Grand Chancellor, or even the Emperor himself. So that's going to be some cool mechanics around this. This role is very similar to the Spy Master, but lifted up to have even more power by the ability to publicly challenge anyone in the bureaucracy in both matters of illegal behavior and also moral behavior. So some cool extra stuff there. It does sound like that could be a fun way to play this. Getting this position and then kind of causing mischief, kind of calling out other people and saying, he's really bad. Is he really? No, but I want to take his position, maybe. Something along those lines. Or maybe get someone from your house into another position by causing some skullduggery. And then next they're going to talk about the ministers. These roles are less powerful than the Grand Chancellor, but more powerful than any other official in the administration of Imperial China. And you can see these on the screen at the moment. There's a bunch of different ones. So you've got Minister of Personnel. He oversees civil service appointments, evaluations, promotions, and then also dismissals. You've got the Minister of Revenue, handles census data, taxation, land distribution, and state finances. And as you can see on the graphic, you can see which lifestyle matches up the most. Most of these are pretty obvious, but it does show up here which ones you want to focus on for these positions. You've got the Minister of Rights, manages state ceremonies, rituals, foreign relations, and the Imperial Examination System. Minister of War directs military appointments, strategy, logistics, and defense. Minister of Justice administers laws, judicial reviews, prisons, and punishments. And then the last one, Minister of Works, oversees public works, construction, engineering, and infrastructure. And as I've been saying, you can see all those on the screen, all these different roles. And then as you can see, the icons for most things actually look the same as they do currently for other realms. I'm guessing that's going to change. It wouldn't really make sense, I think, for some of these to have the exact same icons. So hopefully we do see some changes. They do call out once again, this is work in progress. so I'm sure we will see some kind of change in the future. The last thing they cover in this section is favor of the emperor. The emperor is not without power towards his ministers and top officials. He can even bestow the status of favored minister on any of them, granting them more treasury to work with and other benefits. So I guess it just gives you more money and then maybe like boosts how efficient your tasks are, something like that, so that you do get additional bonuses out of it. The next thing they're going to talk about is province and circuit types. Similar to the admin government type used in Byzantium and introduced in Roads to Power, the celestial government has province types. And what this allows you to do is to specialize these titles. So the kingdom-sized circuits, for example. In contrast to the Byzantine system, the number of each that you are able to do is limited by the circuit type itself, the dynastic era, and specific laws. So it's got a little bit more mechanics to it than it did in the Byzantines. They currently have two primary categories of circuit types, civilian and military. These correspond to the two career paths that you can choose within the machinery of the Chinese state. They also match the era types. They're going to cover that later on as well, although we've kind of heard about that in last week's Dev Diary. The main difference between these two categories is the civilian types will not have any men-at-arms, while the military types will have title-bound men-at-arms, so similar to how it works in the Byzantines. When civilian or military governors need military access, for example for peasant uprisings or something much worse, they can call in military governors as allies into war, usually requested via the Minister of War. So I guess if you're one of these civilian governors, maybe near the edge of the empire, maybe you get some kind of Mongol invasion, you'll need to go to the war minister and say to him like, hey, can I have some troops, please? And then also the military governors around you can be called into the war. So even if you don't have troops yourself, there is some way to defend yourself. And that is why you might want to play either side of this governor type, depending on what bonuses you're trying to get. Different circuit types will also look different on your government CV, so basically your history in government. Governing these titles will give you more or less merit, depending on their tax size or the size of their armies. Next, they're going to show us some more art. They showed this off last week, actually, I think. We've seen this before, but again, looks really nice. This is the background illustration for a Chinese city that you will see obviously when you look at them on the map. And then as they've just been saying, there are these two different versions, civilian and military, and they're going to show off here the subtypes of those types of these governorships. So the first one here is the standard civilian one. This is the most common type within the empire and designates an area that is governed primarily by civilian rule. It does not usually have access to men-at-arms or title-bound men-at-arms either. So you can see it's standard admin, you get +1 merit a month, you get vassal benefits, but this is the standard version, you know, nothing too special, very basic, and everything you see here is placeholder, do remember that. The next civilian one is the industrial administration. This focuses on production and long-term development. You can only have a limited amount of these, and it does not provide any title men-at-arms. And you can see the bonuses here, monthly treasury, monthly merit per tax paid to liege. So the more tax you get up to your liege, the more merit that you get. And then building, construction time and cost reductions, development growth as well. So this is really going to help, obviously, the development, the buildings and things like that. You might want to focus this, I guess, on like safe areas in the middle of the empire. And then the border ones being more these military types. The next one they're going to show is metropolitan administration. This is another civilian version. This is a circuit type which focuses on efficient admin of the urban areas and urban development. It also does not provide any title men-at-arms. It can only be assigned when the dynastic cycle is in the advancement era, and it is limited again as some of the previous ones were. So you can see this one is monthly merit per tax plus 15%, domain taxes plus 10%, development growth plus 25%, control growth plus 10%, and then also some vassal benefits, increasing their governor efficiency based on their diplomacy. Again, everything here is temporary and will change. So don't worry too much about that 25% development growth. It probably won't last that long. They're going to show off here next the Chinese castle holding background illustration. And then next we're on to the military side of things. So the military administration type focuses on raising and maintaining title men-at-arms and military defensiveness. Development growth is hampered, and again, this is limited to a certain amount of places, as some of the previous ones were. You would usually use these on your border realms. So as you can see, the monthly treasury plus 25%, monthly merit per title men-at-arms plus 10%, men-at-arms maintenance is 15% cheaper, and then defender advantage plus 4, fort level plus 2, development growth reduction, but control growth is better. Again, everything here subject to change. The next one they're going to show is only available in the expansion era, and that is the Protectorate Administration. This version is focused on creating a more independent military entity that can sustain and operate itself. It can even independently expand its own realm on orders of the Emperor, and this again is only available in the expansion era. And then as you've been able to see, very similar to the previous one, gives you monthly treasury, monthly merit per man-at-arms, monthly maintenance reduction for your armies, but the size of your regiments and the number of regiments is increased through this. And the men-at-arms damage is also plus 10% better, levy reinforcement rate plus 20% better, but that development growth is minus 30%. So much worse for that, but very much focused on these military units and being able to expand your borders. And you can see the liege benefits unlocks the summon to war interaction, allowing the liege to request the vassal to declare war for a foreign duchy tier title. They talk about this later on, but this is where, as the emperor, you can go to them and say, hey, why don't you declare war on that duchy over there? Even though it's part of another empire, they're currently thinking of allowing that to happen without dragging in the lieges of both sides. So, for example, if you're China and you're going up against Japan, I guess, you could ask one of these guys to go to war with Japan over one duchy, and then the main realms of China and Japan wouldn't get called into this war. It would just be the allies of those duchy tier titles. It's very interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I think this is a cool way for this to work. I think it would be a very good way to specialize empires as well. You could bring this to any empire across the game long term, and it would make empires play out that little bit different. You could give this to people and say, like, hey, you can do these wars. I guess I'll sit back and say I had no knowledge of this, but you can kind of fight it out between yourselves. Let me know again what you think about that, but they do talk about this later on in the dev diary as well, so we'll also talk about it when that does come up. And then the vassal benefits, increase governor efficiency based on your martial skills, so that is going to help you do other things as well. So that sounds like a pretty fun one to do. Probably going to put these on the border where you want somebody to expand and you don't want to get dragged into these wars. So ever since this DLC was announced, we've heard talk of the merit system, we've heard talk of these examinations. Well, how is that actually going to work? How is your career in China going to operate? So exams are the way you get started in your career in Imperial China, and also other realms that take this system on. So as they mentioned last week, there is India and the Roman Empire when you found it. And then as we've seen all the way through this dev diary, there are two career paths, civilian and military. This choice determines what type of positions in the empire you will be considered for. The civilian path usually starts by obtaining a civilian governorship at a low tier title, and then goes all the way up to Grand Chancellor, the right-hand man of the Emperor. The military path will see you sent off to defend the borders of the Empire, first as a military governor, and then later perhaps becoming the war minister. The military path is also one where you will get commanded by the Emperor to wage wars or campaigns on their behalf. They have taken the traditional Chinese 9-rank system for merit, which results in the reverse of usual numbering, going from rank 9 being the starting rank to rank 1 being the best rank. Historically, in Imperial China, there was a candidacy grade, which was used for the exams, and a service grade, which was used when you were in office, but they've combined both of those into one system for, as they say here, simplicity, but don't hear that as like this is an easy mode version of it. They've just done this so it makes a little bit more sense. I wonder if they tried having the two versions and it just didn't really work properly. So you just have this one system that goes all the way through your career. And you can see it on the screen at the moment. This is rank 3 Celestial by the looks of it. This gives you subject gold and subject treasury improvement by 30%, candidate score plus 60, movement power plus 70, and then you can see their total merit. You can see the move that it currently has as well each month. And then you can see the bar for how much you've progressed, very similar to like legitimacy or even like the court amenities system. It looks like it's going to go up and down depending on how well you do. And then that, as they said earlier, is going to unlock opportunities or, you know, bar you from opportunities depending on how well you do. And then you can see there's also going to be completed examinations. No graphic for that at the moment, but I guess the more of those you have complete, the better you're going to do as well. And then speaking of those examinations, how are they going to work? Well, as previously mentioned, merit is the key to secure government offices. The character's merit score indicates how appropriate they are for the positions they want to go for. It represents the documented achievements and moral conduct according to Confucian ideals. An official with higher merit levels has a higher candidate score and, if employed, a higher salary as well. Characters that are not yet employed as governors can also attempt to increase their merit by attending examinations. This is going to work like going to university in some ways. Their rank of merit also directly corresponds to how high a position they can hold within the government, and you can see the UI for this, as I said, looks very similar to like going to university or something like that, but you can see the scoreboard on the right hand side. So I guess it's a little bit of a mix of a tournament and going to university in many ways, but you can do these examinations, hopefully you do well, and then that's going to get you better and better positions, and that's going to help you further and further as you do progress. These examinations can take place from the age of 6, which is kind of crazy, but there you go. You can set your children up for success by having them take the test, which increases their likelihood of attending higher level examinations. Next is the provincial level, another local examination represented in-game by a multi-layered decision. Successfully passing this test will allow you to be considered for county level appointments. More ambitious characters can then set their sights for even more prestigious high-level examinations. The Imperial Examination is an in-game open activity hosted in the capital. It starts with a Metropolitan Examination, from which the top 10 entrants will move on to the exclusive Palace Examination, hosted by the Emperor himself. So there is multiple tiers of this as you progress. The first one's been decision based, and then as they get better and better, you actually have to attend these exams. And then the final one, you're actually interacting with the Emperor and things like that. So that's going to be really fun to do. Apart from being generally gifted, being a good student of Confucius is important to gain a good score in the examinations. In order to prepare, the obtaining and leveling of a Confucian scholar trait is achieved via studying at a university in China or by finding a Confucian elder. They're going to talk more about that later in this dev diary. Yes, we're not even halfway through this dev diary. There's plenty more for us to talk about. Lastly, there are other ways to succeed if you're not very gifted or if you don't trust that the time spent studying will be enough. These were examinees that were known to bend the rules, if not outright cheat. For example, trying to get to know their examiners in advance. So I guess if you know who's going to be the examiner, you can go up and use a hook on them. Maybe you can make them your lover. I'm not too sure. It sounds like there's some kind of interaction there where you can cheat and maybe blackmail somebody into giving you the questions, and then you'll do much better in the examinations. Again, some cool mechanics here, using different lifestyles to be able to progress through the system. You don't necessarily have to be martial focused or maybe stewardship focused or diplomacy focused. For the civilian side, it looks like all the lifestyles are going to be able to interact with this in some way and help you progress, even if you don't do it the most loyal way that you can possibly do. The next thing they're going to cover is the family estate. Yes, we've seen this across multiple DLCs now. When playing inside of China, you will hold a family estate to be built up over generations as a place to call your home. In some ways, it is very similar to the family estate in the admin government type. This is where you can invest in permanent things. I don't like that. We've talked about this before. That will keep benefiting your family in future generations. Unlike in the Byzantines, there will also be a different focus on the kind of benefits you want to get. For example, while you cannot guarantee yourself a high merit score for your children, you can ensure that the estate is well educated so that as they grow up, they will do very well in the examinations. Again, as I kind of mentioned halfway through that, I don't like the fact that this system is just power creep. There's nothing to kind of curtail how good these buildings get. This is a problem I have with the Byzantine version, the Nomads, the Landless version, all the versions we have, is that as you progress through the game, you just inherently get better because nothing bad happens to these buildings. I think there should be schemes that allow you to destroy these buildings. Maybe even, the natural disaster system they're going to talk about in the future could hit certain places and destroy or downgrade these. Maybe if the location they're in gets raided, that could across the board lower these estates. I'm not too sure. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. But I don't like the fact they even call it out here that these just gradually make you better and better. And I'm sure if you start in 867, by the time you get to 1300, you're going to have such a good estate that your dynasty or house members are just inherently going to be better than most other people. Now, obviously, the different houses have these estates as well, so they also get these benefits. But I don't like these permanent increases. This is just a snowballing effect during the time of you playing where you always get better. Nothing ever bad happens to these. So those numbers just go up and up and up. As you get money, you just make them better. And then that just progressively makes you better and better for no real reason. Well, there's reason behind it, but I think you know what I mean. Again, we can talk about it in the comments down below. Another difference from the admin version of this, however, is that things that you want to add to your family estate in a celestial realm will depend on the titles and also the offices that you currently hold. Some things you'll only be able to build if you achieve certain things in your career, such as reaching the rank of minister in the celestial government. Again, this sounds like at first glance oh, this means you won't have all these powerful buildings. But it says here just you'll be able to build them if you hit these requirements. So if you hit a minister very early on and you unlock all these minister buildings, I guess they're just going to stick around anyway and you're going to get those benefits. It would be good if they got grayed out, I guess, so you didn't get the benefits and then you would have this decision, do I want to destroy them and build something else? Or I've invested so much into them, do I want to try get back to that minister position and then reactivate those bonuses? I think that is one way it could work. But how it's written so far, it sounds like, yes, some of these are locked behind different positions in the government, but once you have them, you just constantly have them then. Nothing happens if you lose those positions again. I hope that's not the case. I would like these to be a little bit more dynamic, but let's move on to the next thing. The Imperial Treasury and salaries. This is all going to be about the money side of things. In Imperial China, governors do not own the territory they rule over. They govern on behalf of the government and by extension the emperor. The tax you levy is not yours. They are the empire's. You are not supposed to spend all that on building out your estate or having fancy feasts. That would be corruption and quite illegal, but obviously you can do that as well if you wanted to. In this organized state, taxes are instead sent to the central government, which sends back resources earmarked for government use, a budget you could say for these governorships to use. The governors will also receive salaries, which they can spend as they please. To represent this flow of money, they have implemented a new gold flow, which is used by celestial governments, the imperial treasury system, and there is also a new resource called treasury. Yes, that's what we needed. Another resource type in this game. Let's add it in there like we're a mobile game. I'm only half joking when I say that. Treasury is a liquid asset that can only be used for government purposes in contrast to your personal gold. And then you can see some rules around it here. So let me know what you think about this. We knew this was coming. So you will have like your personal gold and then the gold you can spend within your realm. But then in practice, how does this system actually work and what changes it from feudal vassals where you do obviously pay some of your money to your liege? Well, for the vassals in the empire, all taxes you collect from your sub-vassals and your domain are sent to your liege, and then he sends it to his liege and then his liege until ultimately it gets to the emperor. This is in contrast to feudal vassals where you only send a percentage of your money and then you keep the rest. So in this one, you're sending all the tax and then ultimately the emperor gives you some of that back. So the emperor will convert a large percentage of this vassal income into treasury, the new resource that they just talked about that can only be spent on government tasks and investment. Whatever the emperor does not convert is then added to the emperor's own coffers in gold. That's very nice for him, isn't it? The things he doesn't send, he just keeps for himself. Very, very nice. The emperor then sends this new treasury resource downwards via all their governors based on the taxes collected by each of them, plus any adjustments specific for the titles that they govern. These vassals then send down their treasury to sub-vassals. So again, you're kind of going back down the pyramid here, spreading the money out between all the different titles. This means that you could receive more treasury from the central government than the taxes you actually sent them in the first place. For example, military governors in protectorate border circuits out in the barren desert might receive more since they are paying for a sizable army and they're not making as much because they're living in these deserts. But they're doing a very important job for the emperor, so he's giving them money to keep these borders defended, and that is one example of when this might happen. And then next they're going to show this off. I'm not going to go through everything here. You can pause the video if you're interested. This is showing you like a flow chart of how this works in practice. Again, I'm not going to go through it. It would take me like 20 minutes, half an hour to explain everything going on here. So you can pause this or you can go to the link in the description, read up about this. But you can see how this works. You know, the sub-vassals, the vassals, the top liege, everything going up to them, and then everything coming back down after it has been converted to treasury. You can see the left-hand side is the money, the right-hand side is the treasury, and how that works for each side of this equation. It's very interesting seeing it laid out like this. You can see exactly how it works. You are able, it looks like, to change these obligations so you can get more or less money, kind of similar to how other governments work as well. But you can see everything there, and again, you'll know exactly how it's going to work if you do. But as they've talked about already, this treasury resource, you can't use this on anything for yourself. It has to go on official government business. And what does that exactly mean? Well, in celestial governments, this means all holding buildings, provisional men-at-arms costs, levy upkeep, great project contributions, a few activities, so not all activities, just certain ones that help the realm in total, I would imagine, and then any salaries you pay to your sub-vassals. So that's what's covered by the new treasury system and what you will be spending it on. Conversely, all the things that belong to you privately are paid with your own gold. This is estate buildings, quite a lot of the activities, personal men-at-arms regiments, schemes, core positions, all those kind of things that make sense that you have to pay for yourself. At any given moment, you can also put your own gold into the treasury of your primary title, but be aware you cannot take this gold back out again. So I guess if you're making loads of money and you haven't really got anything to spend it on, you could put more money into the treasury, and then that would allow you to build more men-at-arms, more levies, more great projects and things like that. So there is a reason why you would want to do this. Additionally, treasury belongs to the primary title of the receiver. So if you were to lose that title, the treasury would also move with it. You wouldn't keep it into lower titles and things like that. So I guess if it looks like you might lose a title, I guess that's why they don't allow you to remove gold from the treasury to your own gold. I wonder if there is a scheme that allows you to do that though, and they just haven't talked about it. That could be pretty interesting if there was a way to do that, because then you might think, well, I'm going to lose this position. I'm going to use corruption to steal a bunch of this money before I get kicked out, and then I can use that to do things later on as well. So with how this works, building up a personal wealth is harder in this centralized system. You have your estate, your salary, and other shenanigans to get gold. Of course, there's also outright corruption, schemes and the like, and there's also some shady decisions you can take. Whenever you or another governor does one of these options, though, the dynastic cycle will move towards corruption. They're going to talk about the dynastic cycle very quickly. They've also rebalanced the gold costs of various systems to better reflect that circuit governors aren't actually as rich as kings, even though they will have the same tier title. So yeah, don't look at this and think, my God, going to university costs like 300 gold. It's not going to cost that much. It's going to be much less because the game knows you don't have as much gold because you also have this treasury system. And then the last thing under this section is the Mandate of Heaven. The Emperor is a new legitimacy type. It is called the Mandate of Heaven, which will bring some additional triggers and expectations. It is, however, not easy to receive the approval of the heavens. Should this legitimacy be lower than expected, then the Mandate of Heaven is in doubt, and change will then be in the air, and that is the Dynastic cycle. And that is the next whole section they are going to talk about. Again, this video is probably going to be at least an hour long, so if you've made it this far and you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't previously. But what is the Dynastic cycle? They talked about this in the previous Dev Diary, but this represents the ongoing cyclical nature of dynasties and power within Imperial China. And we saw this graphic last week. You can see it here once again, this kind of circular system, and you work around these really as you progress through the game. Different eras are going to happen. You can have stable, chaotic, you can have advancement eras. They're going to cover all of that in this section. So the Dynastic cycle is the tool they use to represent different periods and ambitions of China in the game. The key periods they wanted to be able to represent are the following. So this is based on history. The Tang Dynasty, this was an expansionist China with more powerful independent military governors. The Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdom period, a divided China where many states tried to claim the Mandate of Heaven and reunite China. The Song Dynasty, an inward-looking China where merit, innovation, prosperity, and scholarship were held in high regard. The Huan Dynasty, a China that was conquered by an outside force, which then tried to adopt and adapt the imperial system. And then the early Ming Dynasty, a stronger defensive China, where the emperor held more power over the government and also saw the revival of the exams and cultural riotings. So they're like the five that they're trying to represent in the game, and they're going to show that in the next section, like the different eras and cycles and how they play out in game. So they know as players, we want to play out alternative history. We want different dynasties and their policies and their politics to play out organically in the game and evolve as we continue. So what they didn't want to do here is basically have it set so like certain years, certain centuries would play out as they did historically. They brought in this new situation type called the Dynastic cycle, which allows them to have this organically happen depending what's occurring in the empire and have it play out differently depending on what you and the AI is doing and even what other realms are doing outside of China, and really work in a more free-flowing way than having it very rigid, which I think is the best way to go about this, making it play out different ways every time that you play. Additionally, this situation gives China a mechanism that encourages it to be united again more easily under the Mandate of Heaven, because as they've said, they wanted this to organically happen, so they want it to fall apart, but they also want it to be reunited like as easily as it fell apart, so it keeps going. It doesn't just fall apart and then China fragments and then nothing really happens with all these systems. They want it to fall apart, but they also want it to rebuild itself back up. Not always in the same way, with these different eras and things like that to mix it up every time that it happens. So with all these eras, what does that actually change in the kind of gameplay of China? Well, each of these eras will affect China in various ways. Aside from the usual modifiers on characters and countries, they also aim to bring things with each era that is unlocked by them that are distinct and useful to players. So these things can be additional laws and policies, new province types, new interactions towards others in China, great projects, and new casus belli. They can also do the opposite of this. They can restrict certain types of casus belli, and they can also limit or forbid personal men-at-arms as well. So depending again on which one of these you're in, it will change how you play out. Maybe you want to play more civilian if men-at-arms are limited, or maybe you want to play military if you unlock more of these casus belli that could be useful to you. An example of this they're going to show off is in the expansion era. You can unlock a new law called the Grand Expansionist Command, and this will allow larger tidal men-at-arms armies at the cost of a heavy burden on the vassals of China. And you can see this here. So change army command structure, max tidal men-at-arms regiments +4, celestial vassal opinion -15, governors can keep no personal men-at-arms and significantly more tidal men-at-arms. Cost for the liege to call upon provisional armies -75% influence. So you could use this to expand your borders very quickly, but then I guess the heavy burden on vassals, I wonder if that reduces like the treasury, things like that. So people get paid less money, could lead to some kind of rebellions, things like that. So you don't want to stay in this as long as you can. You probably want to do this for a couple of years, couple of decades maybe at most. And then these eras, as they've already talked about, do have other effects. So they're going to go through these now. So the first one is the stable era type. Each of these represent a prosperous age. The empire is stable. The Mandate of Heaven is strongly held. These eras enable extra specialized laws, activity options, and represent to a certain extent the stated ambition of the government and the emperor. If the emperor does not fulfill the ambitions set forward by the stable era, they will suffer catalysts that drive them towards an unstable era. Stable eras generally can transition only into unstable eras and not from one stable era to another one directly. Next one is those unstable eras. Whenever the mandate of heaven is not strongly held or the empire is not operating at its peak, the dynastic cycle is considered to be unstable. These eras signify that the cycle is turning downwards, but this can be turned around with a lot of effort. If you are an ambitious servant of the empire and you think that you can fulfill the mandate of heaven better than the current emperor, now might be the time to consider your options. This is when you might overthrow an empire, overthrow a dynasty, and try take their place. And then the last one is the chaotic era type. Whenever the mandate of heaven is completely lost, the empire is shattered, and the dynastic cycle is rotated to an era full of uncertainty, wanton violence, regional independence, and potential. They talked about this last week. This is when the empire titles come in. It sounds like when it shatters, all the empires within there that you don't usually have then get formed, and then the strongest empire can then try pull everything back into a stable era, and then the hegemony gets re-implemented, and then you're like the lead person, and that's how it's going to work. It's going to like fragment fully and then try pull itself back together again. It's going to be very interesting to see how this actually plays out. If it does work, it sounds really fun, having this like boom and bust system and trying to work your way through the system. Because I guess if you're relatively low down, you might want one of these chaotic eras to really boost your place in the world and then come back more powerful than you were previously. Obviously, if you are in control, you want to keep that stable era, or at least that unstable era, for as long as you can. You don't want this chaotic era, because that's going to cause everything to go haywire. And then as they mentioned last week, and they mentioned a little bit earlier on as well, for the stable era, there are two versions of this. So the first one they're going to talk about is the advancement era. In this era, the empire is focused on improving itself by looking inwards through innovations, cultural excellence, prosperity of its people, and good merit-based governance. Offensive wars are more limited, preferring instead to establish tributaries and other relationships. Great projects can also be completed faster, as the focus again of the empire is being directed inwards. Imperial exams will also focus on producing the best governors the empire has ever seen. Historically, the Northern Song period would be set in this era, and that is what China has in the 1066 start date. So you will start in this advancement era in 1066, and you can see this on the screen at the moment. You can see a stable era type advancement, the effects on you, the Son of Heaven. You can see the government effects, you can see the character effects as well, and you're going to have this during this whole era, helping you do things. You can see here the Great Projects construction time, minus 50%. You can unlock special Imperial examination activities. This is going to be very good to do, as they said, to build China up internally. If you don't want to do that, if you want to expand China potentially, well, that is going to be the expansion era, and that is again a stable era type. So in this era, the empire is focusing on growing stronger by looking outwards, pacifying frontiers, expanding its reach through military force, tributaries, and of course the Silk Road. The empire has more tools in its belt to expand, new casus belli, more armies, imperial exams focused on making great military leaders, and also that specialized protectorate admin type that we saw earlier is unlocked during this era as well. On the flip side, there are some downsides, obviously. Vassals that you have that are not admin type will war among themselves more often. It is harder to integrate lands into the ever-expanding empire as well. Rebellions and unrest are more likely. Historically, the early and high Tang period and also the early Ming period could be seen as this version, and that again is what they've kind of based it on. And you can see the tooltip for it here. The stable era type is expansion, the government effects, and then the character effects as well. Life expectancy plus 10. I guess you'll live longer because you're staying fit by being ready for the military. Who knows? But anyway, it does give you that plus 10 modifier. And then you can see those government effects. Hegemon may use the imperial expansion casus belli. Hegemon court positions plus 20% more. Unlocks the military strategist activity type for the imperial examinations. As they said, all these things leaning towards the military. You are kind of forgetting about the internal part that a little bit more. So you probably don't want to stay in this that long, but you can expand your realm. It is easier to do so. You get more armies, you get more casus belli, and you also focus your governors in this mode more so than the admin side. Next is the unstable era types. The first one is just called instability, which is quite apt. The mandate of heaven is seen to be wavering either through corruption, popular unrest, foreign invasions, the emperor acting against his own stated ambitions, non-merit behavior, or even all of the above. This is the general era that China can be found in when things are uncertain. The bureaucratic apparatus is stuttering, bringing less taxes, corruption is easier to commit and more common, rebel factions are more likely to express their discontent through violence, distant parts of the empire may even drift away or declare independence. Historically, the late Tang era kind of fell into this version, And as such, in 867, the game will start for China in this instability era. And then you can see the screenshot, as with the other ones, the government effects and then also the character effects. So you can see a lot more character effects in this version, but also the government effects are pretty drastic as well in some places. So you can see calamities may occur frequently in China. They don't talk about that in this dev diary. I guess we'll get that covered in a future dev diary, how that's going to work. But you can see that your like non-de jure vassals and tributes are more likely to declare or demand independence as well. So they're going to try escape your sphere of control. The other kind of unstable era type is conquest. The mandate of heaven has been taken by a force not inherently Chinese. This era is specifically triggered when the hegemony of China title falls under the hands of someone who does not have the celestial government or a cultural heritage that is not Chinese. Their government type will become celestial when the title is taken regardless. So yes, if you're playing as a realm that is feudal, you take the hegemony of China, your realm will convert into celestial government, and you will play like as a Chinese government realm and try cement your power over this hegemony, which again is going to be a fun mechanic to play out. This era represents a time when the cultural cohesion of China is shaken, and with it the mandate of heaven. This foreign emperor will try and adopt and earn the mandate of heaven and steer China into another stable era, or they can fall into a chaotic era where multiple forces strive for dominance. So yeah, you can come in and try unify things. If you don't do that, it will fall into chaos. And then again, the realm will split into these empires by the sounds of it, and you'll have to fight them off individually and then see what you want to do after that happens as well. A conquest dynasty like this is also able to exert an aggressive outward expansion, since that is most likely what got them here in the first place. Additionally, they can try and make their own culture dominant by preferring those of their own culture to hold governorships. Historically, obviously, the Mongols would be the example of this, coming in and then adopting many of the ways. And you can see the tooltip for this once again, the unstable era type. The hegemon may use the imperial expansion casus belli again. Conquered duchies and kingdoms grant hegemon more than legitimacy. And then the character effects as well. A lot of changes there around legitimacy, vassal opinion, men-at-arms maintenance, all those kind of things. And then the last one they're going to show is that Chaos era. When this era starts, the hegemony of China title is destroyed and all direct vassals of the emperor become independent. Those ambitious enough can declare their own intent to claim the mandate of heaven and adopt a dynastic name for their realm. The celestial government type continues to be valid for these realms, but no true emperor exists. The bureaucracy continues, but decentralized and less strong, and alliances are quickly drawn up between the different people that are going to participate in this system. Historically, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdom period are the basis for this era, and you will get to play this out. Obviously, if the realm really starts falling apart, you will go into one of these. And the government effects, increasing legitimacy after completing great projects, is plus 100 by the looks of it, which is quite a lot. Gain legitimacy by appointing characters with high merit in the affected positions of governorships, councillors, and court positions. And then you also gain, obviously, access to the claim the mandate of heaven decision. Once you are able to do that, you will be able to refound the hegemony and the whole cycle will start again. But how does that unification actually play out in game? Well, what is divided can be reunited. However, this is done through a new casus belli that will allow wars to be plentiful and all in the name of the people and the mandate of heaven. Not about yourself or your own power, obviously. All about making China that little bit better. And you can see here, declare war, consolidate land under the heaven, and that is going to allow you to unify things together and then remake the hegemony. And that will happen if one ruler gets control over 75% or more of the de jure hegemony of China title. They can then use the decision and start a new imperial dynasty. And then, as they said last week, when you do this, you'll be able to select your imperial dynasty name if they haven't already. You can also select one of the 5 elements for your dynasty, coloring China into one of the 5 possible colors. They talked about these colors last week. Now, last week, it was ambiguous as to whether there would be specific colors or whether you could choose a color. It looks like you choose out of the 5 colors. So I guess a mix of both of those options. And they talked last week about what those 5 colors are and how that works. Do go back and watch that video, or it is the previous dev diary if you want to read up on that. We won't cover that again here. This video is far long enough as it is already. And then obviously once you do re-establish the mandate of heaven, you will go into one of those eras and the whole cycle will start again. And then once you've selected to re-establish the mandate of heaven and you go back into that dynastic cycle, and they've covered that a lot in the dev diary, but one thing they haven't covered, they've kind of hinted towards it, is how do these eras actually change? We've been shown like the effects of it, the unlocks, the different kind of bonuses you get in the different versions, but how do you actually move into these? Well, this is going to use everyone's favorite system, the struggle system, in many ways. So this whole system will use catalysts very similar to struggles, and these are triggered events with certain point values, which will push the era into one version or another. The dynastic cycle will usually turn relatively slowly and the eras will last hundreds of years if you balance things right. So the general flow of the era changes will be stable to unstable to chaotic and then back to stable. Although they do say there are some exceptions to this, it won't always work in that exact order. Unstable eras can lead back to stable eras, for example, if the tide is turned well enough, but this generally will not be that easy. But you could do that. So you could go stable to unstable, and then instead of chaotic, you'll go back to stable and then go back to unstable after a certain amount of time and skip the chaotic version entirely. Some eras, as we've already seen, will be triggered by circumstances. For example, the conquest eras will only happen when somebody takes enough of China for the title to be lost, as they described earlier. Catalysts come into play primarily in stable and unstable eras, and they're going to show off some examples here from the advancement era that would lead you towards the instability era instead. Some catalysts are immediate triggers for a new era because of how important they are. So the first one is Hegemon loses the Mandate of Heaven, and they just talked about that. A new house inherits the hegemony title. So yes, if you take over as a new house, I think you immediately get to choose the new era depending on what you want to do, or it triggers one of these eras because that is such a seismic change in the realm. There are also some one-off catalysts that you can cause yourself. So the hegemony loses a war. The imperial capital is raided or besieged. Well, that's very interesting. Just getting raided? I guess it's going to be very hard to raid it down, so it's not going to happen that often. But it's kind of wild, I guess, that you could trigger it that easily. Again, we don't know how badly it's going to be defended, so I guess it's not going to be that easy. Although it does say all besieged, so let me know what you think about that one. That one sounds like it could be a little bit gamified. You could kind of cheese that some ways. You could bring a certain Jarl over and cause some shenanigans to happen. An Imperial House member is murdered, or a governor embezzles from the central government. Again, this is only a catalyst. This isn't an immediate trigger. So I suppose the raiding and besiege could happen, and it's just quickly kind of adding score to the bad side. It isn't going to immediately trigger an unstable age. That would be kind of wild. There are some more catalysts. There are symptoms of corruption and or incompetence. The Imperial Treasury is empty is one. The hegemon appoints a low-merit councillor or a minister. I wonder if you can use a hook to make the Emperor do that, to intentionally move the realm towards an unstable era. And then the last one, failing to hold imperial exams, would also cause it as well. Yet more of these catalysts are political in nature, and opposing movement is strong. So this would have yearly drift. The expansionist movement has the most movement power. They're going to talk about these movements in a second, so you know what that really means. Their intent with these catalysts is to give players more tools to directly stop or start catalysts from happening. So even though the eras might change slowly, inevitably, you can still feel like you're helping it towards one way or another. I think that was some of the feedback from the Iberian struggle. I think the Persian one was slightly better. It didn't last as long, so your impacts had more, well, impact on it. It looks like they've learned from that further and had more things here that you can feel, even though it's going to move slowly, you can push it towards one way or another as a one-off player and doing that. So you can see here some of the catalysts towards instability, and very similar to the struggle UI. If you've seen that, you've seen how this works. And then the last thing they're going to talk about, yes, we're on to the final section of the dev diary finally, is political movements and how they influence the dynastic cycle in China. So unlike the Byzantines, Chinese governors can share values that transcend their personal goals. Using the situation participant group feature, they've created 4 distinct political movements in the dynastic cycle situation. So that is pro-dynasty, expansion, advancement, and conservative. And depending on how powerful each one of these movements is, that will affect the dynastic cycle. And you're going to want to rein these in or empower some of them, depending on what you're trying to do in your campaign. There is also a 5th one, the unaligned group, that doesn't have any unique mechanics and doesn't represent any values, but this is where members who are susceptible to being persuaded will live, and then they can be moved to other movements to empower those. And then next they're going to show off the UI for this. So you can see the dynastic cycle UI, instead of the left-hand side, which shows you the cycle that they showed earlier, this is the political movement on the right-hand side of it. You can see the current 4 leaders of the different movements. You can see your group power, your own personal power, and how many members there are. And then I think the button right next to that is where you can invite people, things like that. So each movement is affected by the dynastic cycle in different ways through character modifiers and unique unlocks. Movements will support the members by using friendly interactions and schemes against each other, and obviously hostile schemes against the other movements, and have access to unique interactions, decisions, and other unique options within them. So think of this, I guess, like the house system in the Byzantines, where you're trying to get like your house to the top to get different governorships and things. It's kind of like that reworked for these movements within China. Some of these decisions will trigger a catalyst that will move the dynastic cycle in a certain direction, as we've already seen. When instability, catalysts will push towards instability, whilst you're in instability, they will push you towards more stability or even into chaos. And then in this tooltip, you can see those options. So promote movement power, slander the power, join any movement, request mentorship, siphon the treasury, slander people, promote people, ask for influence candidacy, request retirement even, and all of these are going to affect those catalysts that push you towards the different eras, and also the bad ones can be used against other movements and things like that. So each movement has a leader, as we've already seen. The movement leader has access to the emperor and can issue a unique petition via decision to further their movement's goals or help fellow members of the movement. In order to become a leader, you have to prove yourself in front of others and defeat the current leader in a political debate. So you have a debate, and the winner, they take over as the leader of this movement. As leader, you can also engage in other types of debate in front of the emperor to win imperial favor, leading your movement towards becoming empowered, granting it more powers to grow the movement and change the dynastic cycle eras. So it isn't just debating against other members. You can do other kind of debates as well, which can empower certain things or push the realm into certain areas as well. You can see here, make movements petition. The current emperor is very likely to accept this petition. Ask the hegemony to increase or decrease the celestial bureaucracy. You will spend 100 influency to do this, and you will travel to the capital. And then you can see the options: change a bureaucracy law, change an army structure law, change province administration, or hold the imperial examination as well. And you will choose one of these options, and that's going to be a good thing to do if you do have the power. The membership's clout is expressed as a movement power score, which we saw in that earlier UI, which is the total of the personal movement powers of all the members of that movement. There are various ways to increase this power, some permanent, such as gaining merit, governor trait experience, and also age, for example, while some are temporary, political schemes, military strength, and then the last one, the power of their disciples. They're going to talk about that in a second, so we won't cover it too much here. Next, you can see a tooltip version of what we just read through. So this will break down how the power is derived for movement power. You can see the same things: merit, rank, age, influence, all these things that we just talked about. They've also added a new type of relation, and that is going to be elder and disciple, to further highlight the social connections and hierarchy in China. The relation is tied to merit. A disciple needs to have less merit than the elder, otherwise this bond cannot be established, or it will end amicably if the disciple gets more powerful than the elder is. Two main ways to acquiring a disciple is to convince them to join your movement or mentor them directly through a new political scheme. Disciples also lend their movement power to the elder, so it can empower you in this movement system as well. And you can see that on the screenshot here: a disciple, a character that respects an elder and will follow their teachings. And then it also gives you some additional merit, less likely to join hostile schemes, more likely to use friendly interactions as well, which is pretty cool to see. The next UI is the request mentorship option that we did see very early on in this dev diary, so long ago now. And this is where you're going to be able to place people into these mentorships and make them better by completing those mentorships as well. And you can see there's a couple of different options here: improve their merit, study Confucianism, study battle tactics, and that's going to help you kind of focus what kind of governor they're also going to be. They talked about this, I think, last week, where you can focus your teachings on a certain area. So I guess if you know it's going to go into like a military era, or you're going to try push it into a military era, you want to try teaching your disciples, you want to try teaching your dynasty members, your house members, your children, so that they're going to be better when that era does hit. You're going to be perfectly set up to take advantage of it. So this is another level of things that you're going to be doing. In a chaos era, the movements, however, are disbanded, but the relation will prevail. The connections you make will help you keep your power base and quickly re-establish these once the mandate of heaven is in your favor. So the actual mechanics of the movement goes, but the connections between everyone in that group stays. And then when the mandate of heaven comes back, you're ready to springboard and make advantage of it once again. Movements will contest each other. That's pretty obvious. They've talked about that already. And a wise emperor will make sure they are all balanced together against each other, lest obviously one of them gets too much power and thinks, hey, do you know what? Maybe we should be the emperor, or maybe we don't even need an emperor at all. And that chaotic era starts, and the whole dynastic cycle starts once again. And with that, guys, that is the end of the dev diary. This has been a very long dev diary. I apologize if my voice is getting a little bit sore by the end, but a lot of talking, a lot of reading. But it's cool to see how these mechanics work, and they're going to cover more of these mechanics in the future. So as they say here, they limited their dev diary size somewhat, so it isn't too much of an info dump all in one go. Well, I don't know if I fully agree with that, but let's go with it. This was a rather large dev diary. I think it could have been 2 personally, but anyway, we did get a lot of information. But there is going to be some more China-related focus in the future, but it isn't going to be next week. They're going to cover hegemony tributaries and how they work. They're going to cover great projects in the future, and they're also going to cover border warfare. This is where I was saying they're experimenting on letting the border realms between 2 empires, or like a kingdom and an empire, to fight each other without actually bringing in the entire realm into those battles as well, and making that happen a little bit more. I think they will probably bring this in, because otherwise when China is a full hegemony, like how hard is it going to be to even take a little chunk out of China if you always have to fight the entirety of China Like, how is any other realm going to take advantage of it? I guess that kind of makes sense because obviously it is all of China, so that is what would happen. But there's also like historical times where like a little bit has been taken off China and it was like so remote, or like the emperor was busy with other things, or the realm was, that they'd never really push back on it too much. And those little border skirmishes happened and it didn't drag entire empires into wars. Let me know what you think about that. I think it would be pretty cool to allow this, especially in China, but elsewhere in the game. I think it would make border wars that a little bit more interesting. And as I said very early in this Dev Diary coverage, if you brought this maybe even to just empires, it would bring some interesting mechanics to empires to make them stand apart from kingdoms, because as we know, they play very similar to kingdoms, in fact, almost identically. Even a little mechanical change like this would be interesting, and seeing how it works out with those realms. But anyway, with all of that, that is the end of the China DLC Dev Diary for today. They do say next week they're going to talk about Japan, its territories, and various mechanics. So that one's going to be very interesting to read along and obviously listen to my fantastic voice too. So as always, if you've enjoyed the video today, hit that like button if you haven't already. If you are new here, subscribe to the channel. I cover all the Dev Diaries news. I do discussion videos on Crusader Kings, all those kind of things. I live stream twice a week. And I also cover EU5 in a very similar manner if you are interested in the next era of history, you could say. But we'll leave it there for today, and I'll see you all next time.